If I ever find that plastic surgeon that messed up my limb replacement surgery, I'm going to kill them with my bare hands. Hi, I'm Ian Douglas. I'm going to walk you through building a dad joke generator, packaging that into a Docker container, deploy on Google Cloud, and we're going to use DataDog for monitoring. So let's dive in and get to it. All right, so I built up a repository, which is just DataDog dad jokes. And I've got a bunch of instructions in there, but for the sake of time and the brevity for this video, I'm going to skip over some things like presume that you know about Python, virtual environments, you know what Docker is, and sort of how to build a container. But I will go through some of these step-by-step kind of as we go. And like I said, we're going to deploy to Google Cloud, and we're also going to deal with DataDog. So I've got all the sign-up links in here. During a workshop, like I said, I would typically take a lot of time to like actually go through each of these steps and make sure everybody got caught up. But for the sake of this video, just for brevity, I'm gonna be skipping some things. Excuse me. All right. So over here in my environment, I've got my virtual environment ready to go. I'm just going to go ahead and install these requirements and get these rolling here. They do take a moment to kind of build up. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to build a simple little Flask application, which is just going to read a list of jokes. And we're just going to randomly pick one and kind of return that back. So we'll be doing some curl calls on the terminal. And once we deploy with Google, we'll make sure that that's working with Google. And we'll be plugging in the DataDog monitoring as well. And we'll check our event dashboard and make sure that those are actually showing up live. All right, so let's get started with the code while these other things are installing. So I'm going to make a new file here. I'm just going to call it dadjokes.py. And I've got a lot of the sample code already written up in the README file. Got all the sort of instructions and everything in here that we're going to need kind of as we go, like how to set up the Google Cloud project and you know what you need to do as far as the virtual environment and whatnot. So like I said, I'm gonna be skipping through some of this just for the sake of brevity. So we're going to grab this first chunk of code, and this is basically just the simple Flask application, which is going through, and it's basically going to read in that list of jokes and store them in an array. And then we're doing all happy path here. We're assuming that it can read in this file and do everything. And then we're setting a route here. So in Flask, this is how we set the routing. Basically that when we hit the URL with no URI path, it's going to call this method called getAjoke. It's just going to randomly pick a position in that array, pick out a joke, and just return that back to the user. Now, for the sake of my own environment, I'm going to run this on port 5002. Port 5000 is already taken on my system, so I'm just going to change this over to 5002 and just bind to all IP addresses on my system right now. So if I come in here and I run this just on the command line by itself, I see it's running on port 5002. I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to curl my local host on port 5002, and there's my dad joke. I applied for a job down at the diner. I told them I really bring a lot to the table. All right, so we know that that's actually going to work now. And if we refresh that a bunch of times, then we get a different joke every time. So we know that our random selection is going to work. From here, what we need to do is package that into a Docker container. So I'm going to stop running this over here. And also in the README, I go into you know, how to actually run this, how to check that it's actually working and so on, and that my local IP is going to be different than your local IP. But from here, we need to go build that Docker image, and this does take a moment, but basically what this is going to do is it's going to download a very slimmed down version of Linux called Alpine. If we go take a look at this Docker file real quick, it's going to pull down this really slim version of Linux called Alpine. It includes Python 3.8. It's going to go through and install our requirements. It's going to copy over our requirements and get those tools installed in the container. And then it's going to tell it how to actually go run our dad jokes application, which is the Flask app that we just saw running. So this takes a moment to kind of download and actually build the container for us. So let's go back. Now that that's running, now we can actually go run the container and make sure that that's going to work. So again, port 5000, I changed that to 5002. And so the second number here is the internal port number of the application that's running. And this first number over on this side is the local port number. And again, because I've already got something running on port 5000, I'm going to change this one to 5001. So in my other terminal here, where I was connecting, excuse me, on port 5002, I'm now going to connect on port 5001 just to make sure that my Docker container is going to work properly. And so I'm going to go ahead and run this on my command line. and this tells me that my Docker container is up and running. So if I come back over to here and I run this now on, run this over here on port 5001, now we can see it's actually talking internally to my Docker instance into my Docker container, and it's actually pinging that dad joke generator running inside Docker. So now that we know that that's running, now we just need to push that up to Google Cloud Run. All right, so, and again, in the README, I document a lot of information about how to actually set up that project. You have to make sure that billing is enabled, that you set up your IAM permissions and so on, that you're set up as the owner of the project so you can do all that work. And so now we just need to tell our local environment, hey, go build the local Docker, push that up to Google. And this also does take a moment. I need to pick my region. So I'm going to run this in US Central since I'm in Colorado. Just going to run the central zone. This is going to go through and is basically going to package up everything I've got, send it to Google. They're going to build a container on Google Run themselves, and then make sure that sanity-wise, like it's running through all their sanity checks, make sure that it's going to be up and running and safe, and then it's going to route all of the traffic to that new Docker deployment. So this does take a moment to kind of, for them to pull down that Alpine build, build that whole virtual container, deploy my code, actually get it up and running, make sure that it's running stable, and then start routing traffic to that for my project. So I already had a project already built up, and I've got a lot of that documented in the README file here as well, where I'm taking this project ID that I have locally already and get that pushed up. So again, just for the sake of brevity, I've bypassed a lot of the setup here, just to make sure that this video doesn't go too long. So yep. As I mentioned, this does take a minute to kind of go through, but it's basically building the container, and we can always pull up the logs here just to see what's really going on over at Google, and we can see that it's up and running and that it's building successfully. So at that point, it's actually built the container. Excuse me. It's actually built the container. It's built the revision for us, and now it's going to start routing all of the traffic for us over to that new instance. And so now if I take this URL and actually hit that with curl, it takes a moment for the first instance to kind of sort of hit Google and wake it up. But now we can see that we're actually hitting our dad joke generator on Google Cloud. So from here now, what we want to do is we want to add DataDog to the monitoring so that on our DataDog dashboard, we can actually see an event happen when somebody actually hits our dad joke generator. So let's go back to our code and let's see what we need to do here. So in the README file, I share some information about the kinds of things that we need to sort of pull out of our dashboard as far as the API key and the app key. So the first thing we need to do is before I import all those jokes, let's get our DataDog environment set up. So these are all of the libraries that we're going to pull in. We've got our API client, our configuration. We're going to use the events API just to push a simple event. And then we're going to go through the configuration. Now we do need an API key and an app key in this case. And so I'm going to go grab those keys and I'm going to put them in here. This video is going to be private, so I'm not too worried about everybody at DataDog seeing my application key because I won't be sharing this video outside of that. So let's go over to our browser and let's go get those details from our dashboard. So we need to go find our organization and go get the API keys and so on from there. So what I want to do is I actually want to just use the search tool here. The search tool here is fantastic. So I'm just going to search for API keys. It's much, much faster and easier to find them that way. So we're going to need two things here. We're going to need the key ID, which is our application ID in the code. And then I'm also going to need the API key. So the first one here is the key ID. And so if I come back over to my code, that's basically going to be my app ID. And then the API key is the hidden field in the browser right now. So we're going to go grab that. And we're just going to copy that in here. And then we're going to put that in our code right here. So this is basically just setting up the authentication details for DataDog. So what we want to do now is whenever somebody actually hits this endpoint, we actually want to build an event and push that to DataDog. And so I'm going to do a couple of things in here. Again, all of this code is inside the README already. So let's go take a look at the README file and see what we need to add to actually go build that event. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this first chunk of code, or the second chunk of code. The first chunk of code was setting up our configuration for our app. But what I want to do here is I actually want to go grab this block of code here, and we're going to pop that into our Python script. So we're going to go pick that random dad joke. I'm actually going to make that part of my title over here. So I'm going to add a little format string on the front, and we'll just put in our random joke as part of the event title. And then for the event text, I'm actually going to grab the user's IP address, and we're going to pop that in here as well. Now, because this is running on Google Cloud, the IP address is actually going to be like an internal IP address within Google. And so in this case, it won't be terribly accurate for us. Everybody that hits it is going to be on the same IP. But for all intents and purposes, if this were running on some other cloud provider, maybe that wasn't behind like a load balancer, there would be other ways of grabbing this remote IP address. Otherwise, we're just going to pass in the title and the text. I'm going to add a tag for joke on here, and then we're just going to call the events API for DataDog, and we're actually going to push that up, and we're going to go create that event. And then in this case, I'm also going to print out the response that we get back from DataDog just to make sure that it worked properly. So if I were to run this locally again, if I run Python 3 dad jokes, no module, oh, because I'm on the wrong terminal here. I wasn't in my virtual environment. So if I do Python 3 dad jokes, we see it's up and running. Now over here in the second terminal, I'm going to run this on 5002 because that's where my local dad joke is running. So what do you call a Frenchman wearing sandals? Philippe Flop. And we're going to do that a couple of times. And then if I come over to my browser on my events dashboard, close this up, go over to my events dashboard, we should see some events showing up here. It does take a minute to kind of show up, but there they go. So these were the ones that we saw, the Frenchman, and so on. So we know that those are working now. What we need to do at this point is just bundle that back up, redeploy on Google Cloud, and then we'll start seeing it from there. So in my terminal over here, I'm just going to hit Control R, start typing the word deploy. It's going to call that back up from my history, and I'm just going to go ahead and run that. I have to pick the region again, and then it basically has to do that whole thing over again. So this takes a couple of minutes. I'm just going to sort of skip that and sort of go to the end on here. So instead of running this again, what I can do is I can actually just curl that endpoint over on Google. And so it's the same endpoint that ends up on Google. And what we'll actually see is those events actually showing up on the dashboard. So I actually pushed this up on Twitter earlier today. And so we can actually see that there was an event a number of minutes ago where somebody actually hit it live. And so if we go zoom in on that one, we can actually see that someone had that, they got the dad joke. And then this is the Google IP address that we saw, this 169.254. And so this was, the previous container running where we were still pushing to DataDog, with that sort of zoom in, zoom out tool. So we'll know that it's actually working, but for the sake of brevity and the sake of time, I'll wrap up the video here. Don't want to make it too long for you. But if I go back and take a look at, so it's actually almost done here. So let me go back. So it's actually routing the new traffic, and there it just finished. So let's try and test that real quick. So we'll just hit this a few more times. So that's just me hitting it a whole bunch of times using curl. And then if we come back and view that in our events dashboard, we should see a whole bunch of new events showing up here. And again, that does take a moment to sort of show up. Close this down. Any minute now, it's going to start showing up. There it is. All right, so there's all the events that we just sent over. So that was me refreshing a bunch of times and hitting it sort of on that production URL. All right, so that was it. So basically, a really quick walkthrough of building a Flask app for a dad joke generator, how we package that into a Docker container and push that up to Google Cloud, and then we implemented the DataDog monitor to push those events So hopefully that was helpful. You're welcome to ping me back on feedback. I'm looking forward to working with the team, and hopefully this will work out. So we'll talk to you soon. Cheers.